Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. This is our little mini masterclass preview lesson. I don't know, you call it what you want to call it. This is our Friday gathering where we're going to be talking about transformation and how, when we're going through cycles of transformation, we can use these cycles as cycles of intentional and deliberate growth. So I am so excited to be here with you all. Give me just a second to get all of our buttons pushed, not literally, maybe literally, not figuratively. All right. Okay, awesome. All right, good morning. Good morning. It is so good to be here with you all this morning. It is finally kind of an almost spring-like day here in Wisconsin, but I know that where I live, which is pretty far north compared to Texas, which is where I'm from, spring is an illusion until June. So, all right, we are going to be talking today about a subject that comes up a lot. And when I talk about this subject, you guys get really curious and interested in it. And I think it's a really powerful and important conversation for us to have that sometimes can help us get clarity on why it is sometimes in the journey of transformation we get stuck, right? We experience an event that maybe feels like a cosmic rug pull, right? Something happens that causes us to lose our foundation and our stability. We lose a job, or our relationship, significant relationship comes apart, or we have a health crisis, or something happens. We can have, lose a loved one. Or even sometimes, we often talk about these cycles of transformation as being kind of cataclysmic and bad. Sometimes it can be something beautiful, like having a baby or getting married. These are things that still cause us to transform our story, right? When we go through cycles of transformation, in particular the disruptive part of the cycle, part of what's happening is our old story doesn't fit anymore, right? If you get married, you are now in a different kind of a partnership, and you're literally, the name of who you are in the world changes, right? Now you're no longer just a person with a name, you're a wife or a husband, right? When we add a child, even if you have children before, every time you add a child, right, it shifts the story of who you are. Now you're a mother of 5 or a father of 5 rather than a father of 4, right? It changes. So anytime our story changes, we have to go through a cycle of transformation. Now, last week I talked about the void and how sometimes when we go through a cycle of transformation and we go through that acute sort of, adjusting to the new normal, whatever that might be, that we get kicked out into a second cycle that is sort of a pregnant cycle, if you will, a cycle that is filled with potential, but we're not actually activating that potential yet. We're sort of sitting in this liminal dream space, engineering our way forward. We get stuck sometimes in that void place if we fail to complete the work of the disruption phase. And one of the things that oftentimes causes us to get stuck is grief. So if you want to follow along with these Friday Lives and you want to really go deep into this, or you're in the middle of a disruptive growth cycle, I want to first of all invite you, please download the free workbook that I created for you. It's called Life's Transitions, and Mastering Life's Transitions, a guide to conscious growth and coaching. It is a workbook. It's really kind of a workbook that I created for you to give you some, intentional contemplations to help you through cycles of disruption. If you want to receive this workbook, if you haven't received it yet, if you're on your computer, it's pinned to the top of the page, and Teresa will post below the link to the workbook. And if for some reason you can't find it, or for whatever reason you're having a challenge with it, just ping Teresa. She's on the comments below, and she'll make sure that you get your link to the workbook. When we we get stuck in grief. Grief is a natural part of the transformation process. It is pretty normal, no matter what the transformation, it is pretty normal that you're going to experience some kind of loss, even if something good happened to you, right? If you go from being, a single person to getting married, there can be places in your life where you grieve for your old story. Or if you become a mother or a father or a parent of any kind, and you're moving into this new story of who you are in that role, you can also grieve some of what you left behind. Grief is a normal part of the transformation process. And it is a place where sometimes if we don't understand what's happening to us, we can get stuck. Especially because grief, as much as we teach it, if you've studied Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of grief, or there's some more evolved versions that have like 7 and 8 stages of grief, we have a tendency to think of grief as being linear, right? You have the loss, you go through the shock, the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the acceptance, right? And then poof, voila, you're done with your grief. And in reality, when we look at the grief process, it's definitely not linear. It's definitely not linear. And if you are in a grief process, or even if you think you're not, you still might be in it, and it might come out of the blue and surprise you sometimes and shock you sometimes because you thought you were done with that, right? It's interesting when we look at how the brain is hardwired, how certain things can trigger emotions and feelings related to loss. Even something like a song that comes up sometimes that maybe you have associations with, that means you've got neural pathways in your brain around that song. Something as simple as a song or a date, a memorable date, especially when you come around in the first and second year cycles of important dates like birthdays, if you've lost a loved one, or the date when the event happened. These are the kinds of things that can trigger grief. And sometimes grief gets triggered for no reason absolutely that we can figure out at all. And that's sort of the nature of grief. So, man, in my fantasy life, I would love it if we would stop teaching grief as a linear process. I also want to talk about how sometimes when we talk about grief, we talk about grief as if we're going to get through it, right? You're going to go through this step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5 in the grief process, and then you're poof, going to come out the other end and done with grieving, right? And it doesn't work that way. We don't get through grieving. And in fact, I think that sometimes when we tell people that we're getting through grief, that they don't get through grief, because if they complete the grief process, it means that whatever that change was, especially if it's the loss of a loved one, becomes permanent, right? And we don't want to lose that story. If you've lost someone you've loved, you don't want to lose that story. You don't want to get through that story. That story is imprinted on your heart and it's here forever. And so we don't get through grief. We experience grief. We are transformed by grief. It helps us redefine our story, but we never get through with grief. And you might never get through with all 5 phases of grief. You might have sadness one day and anger on another day, and you might be bopping back and forth between the stages of grief, and all of that is normal. All of that is normal, and there's no prescribed timeline. There's no rules about grief. So if you are in any way experiencing grief, I want to invite you to give yourself permission to grieve in your way. To grieve in your way. Particularly if it's the loss of a loved one. Now, we oftentimes think of grief as being something related to the loss of a loved one, right? A death of some sort. But we grieve when our story changes too, right? If you've had a health crisis, you might grieve for your healthy self, right? If you've lost a job, even if you're like in a new opportunity that you really love, you still might have longings for aspects of how it was before. And when we don't understand the nature of our hardwiring, and where we're more prone to experience grief, because we grieve differently by design in some cases, then we don't know how to interpret what we're experiencing or feeling. And we oftentimes don't even recognize that what we're feeling and what might be keeping us stuck from moving forward is grief, a grief of some kind. So today I'm going to go through grief and human design and your human design chart. You might benefit from having your human design chart handy. And as we go through talking about grief and your chart, I want to bring us back, first of all, to a couple of really important ideas. Number one, your chart is not a labeling system. That chart is not who you are. That chart is how you are. And that's a very important distinction, because sometimes I think because we are so conditioned towards labels, and we're so conditioned to to want to have like a label because it makes it so much easier, right? If you're a noun and not a verb, it's like, okay, I'm a this, and we can kind of stop and relax and settle in there. And of course, if you do that, eventually your story is going to disrupt. I want you to start thinking about this chart as being how you are, right? How you are, not who you are. That is a very important distinction. It's how you are, not who you are. So it's showing you how you experience the world. It's showing you how you interface with the quantum field, how you interact with consciousness and each other. It's not telling you who you are. And so when we talk about grief by type, I want to be really clear that I'm not saying your chart's going to tell you how you're grieving based on the labels that you have. It's going to give you some insights as to what you might be sad about losing, because your hardwiring, your chart, is going to make you predisposed to needing certain qualities and certain kinds of energies, right? So we're going to look at grief by type. I'm going to go through grief in the lines of the profiles. I'm going to look at grief and the centers, and grief and the circuits. Now, I do not have any visuals for you, except Teresa has one handout for you. So I do want to just let you know, please, if you are really curious about this information, take good notes because you're going to need to take notes for this. I know I'm used to teaching with slides, but we're not doing that today. All right, let's go through, first of all, grief by type. And again, remember, this is not a hard and fast rule. This is not a formula, because your human design is also not a formula. You might not relate to the grief by type, and you might. Okay, so this is not a formula. This is just a recommendation to help you explore, what did you lose when your story changed? How might that impact you based on your design? And how can you then, and this is the cool part about it, once you recognize what you're grieving, that gives you information that helps you think about when you're in the void and you're reconstructing the direction in which your life is taking you, what do you need to make sure you're adding to your vision for what you want next, right? You've got to include those pieces that you feel like you lost, because those are pieces that maybe are so important to you. They're part of your story that you want to add back in. All right, number one, manifestors. Manifestors tend to grieve the loss of power and autonomy, okay? And of course, let's remember that manifesting generators, because they are a hybrid type, may also experience that as well. So if you have a loss of some kind, you might feel powerless, and you might feel like you lost your autonomy. And for a manifestor or a manifesting generator, that can be a big source of grief. Generators and manifesting generators also can grieve a loss of momentum. When you have a defined sacral, you're like all revved up and ready to go. And if it's feeling like there's nowhere to go because you don't know what the next right thing is, and you're feeling kind of like, okay, I have all this energy, but come on, right? That can be a grief over the loss of momentum. So if we look at the manifesting generators again, that means loss of momentum, loss of power, loss of autonomy. All right? Our projectors. Projectors can grieve a loss of value. So if you're a projector and maybe you lost something where you felt seen, heard, recognized, like you were part of something and you had an important role, if you have a loss, you might grieve the loss of your value, feeling like you are not valued as a result of this loss. Reflectors can lose or have grief over the loss of a sense of home, and that's an internal sense of home. Or if they have to leave, let's say, for example, let's say you're a reflector and your partner's in the military, and you are moving every 2 years. That was kind of my life growing up, right? That loss of place and a sense of home And that constant shifting of place and home can be a real loss if you are a reflector. Okay, next, let's go through the lines of the profiles. So I'm going to talk about all 6 lines. You want to look at your profile on your chart. That's the little number that looks like a fraction on your chart. Your profile, that fraction will have 2 numbers in it. So you want to look at both of those numbers. And as I go through the grief of the lines, think about whether you are experiencing any grief associated with your lines in your profile. So the line 1 grieves the loss of understanding. It is very common for people with first line profiles and fourth line profiles to get stuck in the question, why? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Which can be an unanswerable question. And it certainly can be a question that can get us pretty darn stuck in the tape loop of questions that we have in our heads, right? The line 2 can grieve the loss of energetic integrity, meaning when you have a second line profile, you need alone time for rest, renewal, restoration. And sometimes cycles of disruption take away rest time, take away that ability to be able to retreat. Think about this in the context of being, let's say, a new parent, right? If you are a new parent, the odds are pretty high your alone time needs are not going to be met for a while, especially when you have a baby, right? And so you may be grieving that capacity, that ability to be able to say, I'm going to go do something by myself for a little bit, right? Number 3, line 3. In line 3, you can grieve a loss of confidence. When you have gone through that third line experience and you've done all the exploration and experimentation, and you've come to that conclusion of, okay, this is what works, and then that goes away, you know you have to start over with that exploration experimentation process. And that can give you a loss of confidence because now you have to learn and start all over again. The line 4 grieves a loss of stability. Line 4s like things to stay the same. And as I said, they can sometimes also get stuck in the question, why, right? So the line 4, when they go through disruption and things are kind of chaotic, then that line 4 can oftentimes go through a grief for the loss of stability, right? The line 5 are 5th line profiles. The line 5 can go through a grief of the loss of safety. When you are a 5th line profile, if you've built a community of people who really see you and really know you, and the projection field that you're in is a healthy projection field, and you lose that for whatever reason, then that loss of stability that loss of safety, and feeling like, oh, I don't know this environment that I'm in anymore, and now I'm going to be subject to the projection field again. Other people's thoughts and my reputation is going to be at stake again. And last but not least, line 6 profiles can grieve a loss of purpose. So if you have a line 6, your life purpose and your life path, meaning and mission are very important to 6 line profiles. And if you lose that for whatever reason, then you can feel really stuck in that loss of purpose as you reconfigure your life in response. Those are the lines of the profiles. Next, let's look at the centers. And again, I want to just stress that when we look at centers, again, because human design is not a labeling system, we're not looking at this defined center equals this open centers equals this. We're looking at the idea of optimizing how the center functions. So if it's open, it's optimized at a certain, in a certain way, right? You know how to self-regulate in the sea of energy that you experience with your openness. If it's colored in or defined, you're learning how to internally self-regulate, right? Internally explore with awareness, how is this energy going to impact others? And you have to stay consistent, right? You have to learn how to love and accept this part of yourself, and also to really make sure you're expressing the highest potential of that center. So when I go through the grief associated with the different centers, I'm really talking about the center at its optimized expression, regardless of whether it's colored in or white. Now, if you relate to any of these, it might really benefit you to go back to your chart and say, oh, this loss, this grief is associated with, let's say, the will center. How is my will center configured? Oh, it's defined, it's colored in. I probably need to pay attention to that because I'm really relating to this, and there may be something that's happened in my life that's causing me to not be optimizing this center very well in my life, and maybe I need to look at the themes of the center and explore whether I need to optimize the themes in this center in my own chart. So the head center grieves the loss of possibility and hope. The Ajna center grieves the loss of beliefs around what they thought was true. The throat center grieves the loss of power. The G center grieves the loss of direction and love. The will center grieves the loss of integrity and value. I can copy and paste this information into the comments later, so when we're done, I'll make sure that I put all this in a comment section for you on Facebook. The emotional solar plexus grieves the loss of creativity and the loss of faith. I thought everything was going to be this way, and now it's not. I had faith in that, and I've lost my faith. And sometimes it's big faith. It's like faith in God, right? The sacral center grieves the loss of meaningful work. Grieves the loss of meaningful work. The spleen grieves the loss of safety and the loss of time. And the root center grieves the loss of motivation and drive. So you can start now starting to put some of this stuff together. So let's say that you are a projector. And let's say you're a third line projector. And let's say, you're not really optimizing your will center, your center that's associated with your sense of value. You can start to see how, as a projector, you lose your potential, you grieve your loss of value. As a third line, you might grieve your loss of confidence. As somebody with a defined will, maybe that you're not using correctly, you might grieve the loss of integrity and value. And that starts to help you understand, why does a cycle of disruption hit you so hard, right? And what in that cycle, that next season of growth, when you're crafting your vision for where you're headed next, what do you need to include in that bigger vision? Well, you need to include that in whatever you create next, you better darn well be valued, right? That you need to have a partnership, work situations, health and wellness, everything built around the idea that you are inherently valuable because you exist, and your world, your dreams need to reflect that value back to you, right? That starts to help you use that grief as a clarification tool when we begin to ask the question, what's next? What do I want to build next? Last but not least, and Teresa's going to post a Dropbox link to an image for the circuits in the chart. This is a little bit trickier, and I'm just putting this here mostly for fun because most of us, if not all of us, are a pretty good mix of all three circuits. But if you look at the chart and you look at how the chart, all the little lines in the chart, those lines flow in specific collections or groupings of energies, and we call those circuits. So just like if you look at the wiring in your kitchen, you have electrical circuits that run through your house. Your chart also has circuits that runs through your chart. And generally speaking, most of us are a good mix of all the circuits. However, we sometimes tend to lean more heavily or relate more heavily to one of the circuits, especially if you have a lot of colored in parts in a particular circuit. So the individual circuitry grieves the loss of autonomy. The tribal circuit grieves the loss of safety and love. And the collective circuit grieves the loss of meaning and purpose. Now you can see some of these start to repeat themselves. So again, as you're looking at your chart layer after layer, which is really how I recommend that you look at your chart. Look at first your type. Then look at your profiles. Then look at your centers, open and defined. And remember, when we're talking about grief in the centers, we're not talking about open centers and defined centers. We're talking about optimizing the way your specific centers are used. And so if you're really relating to one of the griefs of the centers, go back to your chart and look at, how is this center configured in my chart? Oh, if let's say, for example, let's go back and let's look at the emotional solar plexus is the loss of creativity and faith. And let's say you have an open emotional solar plexus, so you're emotional empath. Well, if you're not recognizing that with your openness, you need to self-regulate your emotional energy and know how to stay connected to your own emotional energy in the sea of energy that you're taking in. If you're actually, pleasing everybody and adapting your emotional response to make sure it meets the emotional response in the room, and you're not living out the highest expression of your open emotional solar plexus, you might hold grief there. And that holding grief there is going to tell you that part of what you're grieving is your loss of creativity and faith. And so when you reconstruct your life, you need to be really clear that you need to add back in, first of all, a good awareness of your open emotional solar plexus. And number two, you need to make sure your new vision for what you want to build includes creativity and a restoration of faith. All right. That's it. That's what I got for you. That's a lot. This is super, super deep. Certainly, this is a very advanced exploration of your chart and certainly of disruption. But I wanted to give this to you because every time I post this or talk about this, people really feel like this information helps them assess what's really going on. Why am I stuck? Why can't I move forward? I would also encourage you, again, to don't get too complicated with this. Sometimes we want to make human design really complex. This is a good way to look at the nuances of it. Certainly, I would say it's also okay to just say, I feel really sad about this thing that happened, or I feel really angry about this thing that happened, and allow yourself to be with that. And don't judge it, and don't resist it, and don't make yourself think, oh, I got to get through this. There's no getting through it. There's integrating it. There's feeling it. There's moving that energy, because those emotional experiences are energies, moving that and letting yourself be with the feelings for a while. Sometimes we want to push through the negative feelings, and they're not negative, right? Your grief is evidence that there's a change at hand. Something has changed. And, most of us, if not all of us, have a certain degree of resistance to change. And it's really not resistance to change. Let me just say, what we really resist is moving into the unknown. We don't really resist the change, unless, of course, we've lost a loved one, and that's different. But if we're, if we've had a loss or a disruptive experience, oftentimes, as I talked about a couple weeks ago, oftentimes it's really sort of in a hidden way, an answer to a prayer, right? It's the rain that brings the flowers that we prayed for. And sometimes when we go through that, we want to rush through it, and we don't let ourselves have the emotional release we need to allow to experience and accept. And it's really important with emotional energy, especially, to accept those quote unquote negative feelings and to be with them and sit with them for a little bit. You don't want to get stuck in them. I mean, if you start to tell a sort of a story en route about your feelings, and it's starting to become part of your identity, then you have, then it's time to move into a different space with your grief process. But a lot of times we don't let ourselves just be with that acute phase of the grief over the loss. And if you don't, it doesn't go away. It just gets moved into the body until you find a better time, space, place to let it go, or your body starts to give you symptoms that, hey, we need to really deal with this. We need to go back and really sit with it and be with it and allow it, because it's just energy. It's just energy that has to move. And as we move into a new growth cycle, sometimes we can't go into that new growth cycle until we really get eyeball to eyeball with our emotional energy and our grief and allow for it and accept it. It actually moves faster when we accept it rather than resist it. So sometimes just sitting with it and letting yourself be with it allows you to process it more than it does if you push through it and try to ignore it. All right, that was a lot. That's what I've got for you today. Take good care of yourselves. Be well. I will see you next week. and I'll post next week what the topic will be in the Facebook group. Do make sure you download the workbook. We are working on pages 1 through 20 in the workbook. So get your workbook, go through those pages, really do some of the contemplations. Especially right now, the sun is highly in the gate 42. Time to complete old business, be done, so we can create room to move forward into the new. So take good care of yourselves. I'll see you next week.